A starving dog refuses to drop a military medal. Why? This German Shepherd's mission will reconnect estranged sisters and expose powerful men's secrets. Subscribe and comment your location to discover what's buried in the beach box. The summer heat in Port Haven, Alabama hung heavy over the town square, shimmering off the colonial-style buildings that had watched over the sleepy coastal community for generations. Margaret Caldwell dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief as she made her way across the square's worn brick pathways, her sensible shoes clicking in a familiar rhythm. At 68, she still carried herself with the same straight-backed posture that had commanded respect in her third-grade classroom for over 40 years. "Morning, Miss Caldwell," called Sam from the hardware store, waving as he swept the entrance. Margaret nodded politely without breaking stride. "Good morning, Samuel. Looks like another scorcher." Her day followed the same pattern it had since retirement 3 years ago. Breakfast at 7:15, crossword puzzle until 8:30, then a brisk walk to town for groceries. Every Tuesday and Thursday, without fail, regardless of weather. Predictability was her anchor in a world that had taken too much from her too many times. She was examining peaches at Green's Market when she first noticed the commotion. "Someone catch that dog before it gets hit," a woman shouted. Margaret looked up to see a gaunt German shepherd trotting determinedly across the square. Its ribs protruded beneath a dull coat, and one ear flopped awkwardly where a notch had been torn. But what struck Margaret most was the dog's eyes, amber and knowing, filled with unmistakable purpose as it clutched something in its mouth. "Poor thing's been wandering around for days," said Elaine Green, stepping out from behind the counter. "Sheriff tried to catch him yesterday, but he's skittish as a ghost." Margaret watched as the butcher from across the street approached with a ham bone. "Here, boy, come on now." The dog stopped, eyeing the offering but making no move toward it. In its mouth, Margaret could now see a small metal object glinting in the sunlight. "What's he got there?" she asked. "Looks like a keychain or something," Elaine replied. "Won't drop it for nothing, not even food." Something about the animal's determination stirred something in Margaret, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Before she could think better of it, she was crossing the street, her grocery list forgotten. "Be careful, Miss Caldwell," someone called. "Might be rabid." Margaret ignored the warning. Kneeling slowly, mindful of her arthritic knees, she met the dog's gaze. "Hello there," she said softly. "You've been on quite a journey, haven't you?" The German shepherd's ears perked forward slightly. It didn't approach, but it didn't retreat either. "I'm not going to take that from you," Margaret assured it, noticing how carefully the dog held what was indeed a small keychain with what appeared to be a medal attached. "But you look like you could use a meal and some shade." To everyone's surprise, the dog took 3 cautious steps toward Margaret, still maintaining a safe distance. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Sheriff Davis, who had appeared with his catch pole. "That's the closest it's let anyone get." Margaret straightened slowly. "I think he just needs someone to understand his mission," she said, surprising herself with the words. "And I believe I'm about to stray very far from my schedule today." Margaret's pristine craftsman bungalow sat 3 blocks from the town square, its white clapboard siding and wraparound porch as meticulously maintained as her daily schedule. Inside, every surface gleamed, every item had its designated place, and not a single photograph adorned the walls. A home organized with military precision that reflected its owner's need for control. Now that ordered sanctuary faced invasion. "This is temporary," Margaret informed the German shepherd as she stood on her immaculate porch, hesitating before opening the door. The dog waited patiently, still clutching its precious cargo. "Just until we find where you belong." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11:30. She was already dangerously off schedule. With a deep breath, she crossed her threshold, holding the door for her unexpected guest. The dog remained on the porch, appraising her with those intelligent amber eyes. "Well, isn't this what you wanted?" Margaret asked, annoyed at feeling judged by an animal. Slowly, the shepherd stepped inside, its nails clicking against the hardwood floors that Margaret polished every Sunday without fail. It moved deliberately, as though mapping escape routes. "Kitchen's this way," she said briskly, leading the way. "I have rules. No furniture, no bedrooms, no shedding, though I suspect that's beyond your control." In the kitchen, Margaret filled a bowl with water and rummaged through her refrigerator, emerging with leftover roast chicken. The dog watched attentively, but made no move to release the keychain. "You'll need to put that down to eat," she pointed out. The shepherd looked from the food to the object in its mouth, clearly conflicted. "I won't take it," Margaret promised, sliding the bowl toward the far corner. "I may be particular, but I'm not dishonest." Something in her tone must have convinced the dog. It carefully placed the keychain on the floor, keeping one paw protectively beside it while drinking thirstily. Margaret crouched slowly, examining the item without touching it. A tarnished silver medal hung from a worn leather strap, its surface partially obscured by dirt and age. She could make out what looked like a nautical design and the partial inscription, LLUM 19. "Looks military," she murmured. The telephone rang, startling both of them. The dog snatched up the keychain and retreated to the corner. Margaret Caldwell speaking. Her voice automatically shifted to the crisp tone she'd used for 40 years of parent-teacher conferences. "Miss Caldwell, it's Nancy from the library committee. You missed our 10 o'clock meeting. We were concerned. You've never missed before." Margaret closed her eyes. "I apologize. Something unexpected came up. Are you all right? Should I send Tom over?" "No," Margaret said too quickly. "No need to trouble Dr. Wilson. I'm perfectly fine. I'll explain tomorrow." After hanging up, Margaret found the German shepherd watching her intently. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "Now I'll have the entire town inquiring after my health by dinner time. Small towns and their gossip. One deviation from routine and they assume you're dying." The dog tilted its head, the keychain still secure in its jaws. "I suppose you need a name if you're staying," Margaret said reluctantly. "And we need to get you to a veterinarian. That ear looks troublesome." The dog's tail gave a single, tentative wag. "Don't get attached," Margaret warned, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing the dog or herself. "This arrangement ends once we decipher that medal and find where you belong." She checked her watch. Her entire afternoon schedule was now compromised. The carefully ordered day she had planned lay in ruins, much like the neat life she had constructed after the pain of her past. For someone who had spent decades ensuring nothing could disrupt her carefully constructed isolation, this mangy intruder, with its mysterious mission, represented everything Margaret Caldwell had spent a lifetime avoiding. Unpredictability, attachment, and the dangerous reopening of doors long sealed shut. "This is only temporary," she repeated firmly, though the dog seemed unconvinced. "Very temporary." Dr. Tom Wilson's veterinary clinic occupied a converted Victorian house at the edge of town, its wraparound porch now a waiting area where pet owners sat on mismatched furniture. When Margaret arrived with the German shepherd cautiously trotting beside her, the receptionist's jaw visibly dropped. "Miss Caldwell, you have a dog." The young woman's surprise was understandable. Margaret's aversion to pets was well known throughout Port Haven. "Not mine," Margaret clarified firmly. "Found. Or rather, he found me." In the examination room, Dr. Wilson, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and perpetually sunburned cheeks from weekend fishing trips, whistled low upon entering. "Margaret Caldwell with a dog. Now I've seen everything," he teased, blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Margaret stiffened. "I was simply the only person he would approach." "That's so." Tom knelt, offering his hand to the shepherd who sniffed it cautiously. "Still carrying that trinket, I see. Sheriff Davis mentioned it. Won't give it up, huh?" "Not willingly," Margaret confirmed, though he did set it down to eat. With gentle hands that belied his large frame, Tom began examining the shepherd, who watched warily but permitted the inspection. "No collar, no chip as far as I can feel," Tom murmured. "Male, probably 5 or 6 years old. Malnourished, but no signs of abuse. I'd guess he's been on his own for weeks, not years. That ear's an old injury, nothing to worry about." Margaret found herself oddly relieved. "So he's healthy? Needs food, rest, and probably some flea treatment, but otherwise remarkably good considering." Tom straightened. "Mind if I take a look at what he's guarding so carefully?" Margaret nodded. "I told him I wouldn't take it. Perhaps you'll have better luck." To their surprise, when Tom extended his palm, the dog hesitated, then carefully deposited the keychain into it, though his eyes never left the object. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom whispered, examining the tarnished metal. "This isn't just any trinket, Margaret. It's a silver star. Military decoration? Yes, and a significant one. For gallantry in action." Tom turned it over. using his thumb to gently clear away grime. There's an inscription here, and coordinates, I think. He crossed to the sink, washing the metal carefully. The dog watched, visibly tense, moving closer to Tom's side. Relax, buddy. I'm not stealing your treasure, Tom assured him. Turning to Margaret, he added, Bellum, 1968. That's what it says, and there are definitely coordinates on the back. Bellum? That's Latin for war. No, look, it's part of a name. Tom handed the medal back to the dog, who immediately reclaimed it. There's a small fishing village called Point Bellum about 30 miles down the coast. Been there a few times for the flounder. Margaret's mind raced. That's where he's from. Could be, or at least where this medal's owner lived. Tom scribbled on a prescription pad. Here's for antibiotics, just precautionary, and some special food to help him gain weight. What will you call him in the meantime? Call him. Well, we can't just say the dog forever, can we? Margaret frowned. Names meant attachment, permanence. I haven't decided to keep him. Of course not. Tom agreed, though his expression suggested otherwise. But he needs something temporary, at least until you solve the mystery of Point Bellum. Margaret studied the German shepherd who had fixated on her with laser focus since their first encounter. Something about his determined grip on that medal, his unwavering commitment to whatever mission drove him, struck a chord within her. Sergeant, she said suddenly, given the military connection. Tom smiled. Suits him. As they prepared to leave, Tom placed a hand on Margaret's arm, the first human contact she'd permitted in months. Margaret, it's good to see you, involved in something. She stiffened. I'm involved in plenty. The library committee, the historical society. You attend meetings and take minutes, he interrupted gently. That's participation, not involvement. There's a difference. Margaret withdrew her arm. I should get going. I've already missed one appointment today. You know, Tom called as she reached the door. Some disruptions are worth the inconvenience. Margaret didn't reply, but as she led the newly named sergeant to her car, his medal glinting in the afternoon sun, she couldn't silence the treacherous whisper in her mind. What if Tom was right? Margaret set her alarm 30 minutes early the following morning, adjusting for the additional time she calculated would be required for Sergeant's needs. When it rang at 6:45 a.m., she was already awake, listening to the unusual sounds of another living being in her home. The gentle click of nails on hardwood, the soft whine as Sergeant patrolled the perimeter of her living room where she'd reluctantly allowed him to sleep on an old blanket. I see you're an early riser too, she commented, finding him sitting alertly by the back door, metal still clutched in his mouth. At least you've got one good habit. After a quick breakfast, during which Sergeant again set down his precious cargo only to eat, Margaret stood at her kitchen counter, internal conflict evident in the tight line of her mouth. A map of the coastal region lay spread before her, with Point Bellum circled in red pencil. This is highly irregular, she told Sergeant, who watched her with those intelligent eyes. I haven't left town on a weekday in. Margaret trailed off, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd deviated so dramatically from routine. Her finger traced the coastal road. It would be a 45-minute drive each way, assuming no traffic. She'd miss her standing appointment at the salon, would need to cancel lunch with the library committee, and worst of all, would be venturing into unknown territory without preparation. The telephone rang, and Margaret answered immediately. Yes, Nancy, I know about the lunch. I'm afraid I need to cancel. No, I'm not ill. An errand has come up. She paused, listening to the concerned inquiry. Out of town, yes. No, not a doctor's appointment. Really, Nancy, I appreciate the concern, but it's nothing to fuss over. After hanging up, Margaret sighed deeply. That's done it. The rumor mill will be churning by noon. Sergeant tilted his head, the metal glinting in the morning light. Don't look at me like that. This is entirely your fault, Margaret said, though there was less irritation in her tone than she'd intended. I'm a creature of habit, Sergeant. Predictability is safe. Nevertheless, 30 minutes later, Margaret found herself guiding her immaculately maintained 2010 Buick sedan, purchased new and serviced religiously every 3 months, onto the coastal highway, with Sergeant sitting up straight in the back seat, his focus unwavering on the road ahead. The back seat only, she'd instructed firmly when he'd attempted to claim the passenger seat. And if you shed, I'll have to vacuum immediately upon our return. The drive along the Gulf Coast was beautiful despite her anxiety. The morning sun glittered on the water to their right, while pines and live oaks draped with Spanish moss lined the left side of the highway. It was the sort of scenery Margaret had once painted in her youth, before she'd packed away her art supplies along with other remnants of the passionate young woman she'd once been. "I haven't been this way in decades," she admitted aloud, surprised by her own confession. Sargent whined softly in response. "Point Bellum used to be known for its shrimping fleet," she continued, finding unexpected comfort in narrating to her canine companion. "My father took me there once when I was very young, before everything changed." The dog's ears perked up at the mention of the village. "You understand that name, don't you?" Margaret observed, meeting his gaze in the rearview mirror. "You're a peculiar animal, Sargent." As the miles passed, Margaret's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel gradually relaxed. There was something almost liberating about driving away from Port Haven, from the carefully constructed life where every minute was accounted for, where spontaneity had been systematically eliminated along with the potential for disappointment or pain. Then, without warning, the Buick's engine stuttered. The dashboard lit up with warning lights. "No, no, no," Margaret muttered, guiding the faltering vehicle to the roadside. "This can't be happening." The car shuddered once more before the engine died completely, leaving them stranded on a stretch of highway with no buildings in sight, just marsh on one side and ocean on the other. Margaret tried the ignition again. Nothing. "Perfect," she said bitterly, reaching for her cell phone only to remember she'd left it charging on her bedside table, one more deviation from her normal routine. Absolutely perfect. From the back seat, Sargent watched her with what Margaret could swear was sympathy in his amber eyes. "Don't worry," she told him, trying to mask her rising panic. "I'll figure something out. I always do." But as cars whizzed past without stopping, Margaret Caldwell faced an uncomfortable truth. For the first time in years, she would have to rely on the kindness of strangers. The summer sun climbed higher, baking the interior of the stranded Buick. Margaret had positioned herself on the narrow shoulder, hand raised half-heartedly whenever a vehicle approached. Most zoomed past, their occupants offering nothing more than curious glances. The few who slowed seemed to reconsider at the sight of her rigid posture and tightly pinched expression, a woman who looked more likely to deliver a lecture than express gratitude. "So much for Southern hospitality," Margaret muttered, dabbing perspiration from her forehead with her handkerchief. She'd removed her cardigan, a concession to the heat that made her feel oddly vulnerable. Sargent watched from the shade of the back seat, panting lightly but maintaining his vigilant hold on the metal. "You could help, you know," she told him. "People stop for dogs." As if understanding, Sargent rose, squeezed through the gap between the front seats, and nosed his way out the driver's door. Before Margaret could protest, he trotted to the edge of the highway and sat at attention, his good ear pricked forward. "Sargent, come back here this instant." He ignored her, maintaining his sentinel position. Within minutes, a battered blue pickup truck slowed, then pulled onto the shoulder 20 yards ahead. A lean man in his 60s emerged, wearing faded jeans and a sun-bleached fishing cap. "That your dog, ma'am?" he called, approaching cautiously. In a manner of speaking, Margaret answered, straightening her linen slacks. "We're traveling together." The man stopped several paces away, respectful of her space. His weathered face crinkled with amusement. "Car trouble, obviously," Margaret replied, then caught herself. "I mean, yes. It simply died without warning." He nodded, eyes crinkling at her clipped tone. "Mind if I take a look? Are you a mechanic?" 30 years in the Navy, ma'am. Worked on engines that could power a small city. Your Buick shouldn't present much challenge." Margaret hesitated, decades of self-reliance warring with her predicament. "That would be appreciated." "Name's Jack," he said, extending a calloused hand. Margaret Caldwell. Her grip was brief but firm. Jack popped the hood and leaned in, hands moving with practiced ease. "Where you headed?" "Point Bellum." His hands paused momentarily. "Not much there these days. Tourist season's over." "I'm not a tourist. I'm looking for—" Margaret glanced at Sargent, who had returned to her side. "Information. Information," Jack repeated thoughtfully. "About what?" Margaret's instinct for privacy battled with necessity. "About who this metal belongs to." She gestured to Sargent's precious cargo. Jack's attention shifted to the dog. "May I?" To Margaret's surprise, Sargent approached the stranger and, after a brief assessment, allowed Jack to gently examine the metal without relinquishing it. Silver Star, Jack murmured, recognition immediate. Vietnam, by the date. You're familiar with military decorations. Jack's smile didn't reach his eyes. Intimately. He straightened, returning to the engine. Alternator's shot. I can rig something temporary, but you'll need a proper replacement. As he worked, borrowing parts from his own truck, Margaret found herself sharing more than she'd intended. How she'd found Sargent, the coordinates, their mission to Point Bellum. Jack listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the dog with newfound respect. There, he announced finally, wiping his hands on a rag. It's not pretty, but it'll get you to Point Bellum. There's a garage there, Donovan's. Tell Lewis that Jack Tucker sent you. He'll treat you fair. I appreciate your assistance. Margaret reached for her purse. I'd like to compensate you. Jack raised a hand. Save it for Lewis. Besides, he nodded toward Sargent. Looks like you're on important business. As they prepared to part ways, Jack hesitated. The coordinates on that metal, they reference somewhere specific in Point Bellum? I believe so. Be careful what you dig up, Miss Caldwell. There was something in his tone that made Margaret pause. Some things are buried for a reason. Before she could question him further, Jack returned to his truck. Lewis opens the garage at noon. Town's just one main street. Can't miss it. As his pickup disappeared around the bend, Margaret turned to Sargent. What do you make of that cryptic warning? The dog merely watched the road ahead, metal secure in his jaws. You're right, Margaret sighed, settling behind the wheel. Only one way to find out. The Buick started with a reluctant grumble. As they resumed their journey, Margaret found herself recalling another time she'd been stranded on this highway. Nearly 50 years earlier, in a thunderstorm, with her younger sister Caroline beside her. They'd laughed then, two young women sharing an adventure, before life and pride had driven an immovable wedge between them. I wonder whatever happened to her, Margaret murmured, the thought escaping before she could contain it. She glanced at Sargent in the rearview mirror. The past has a way of staying buried, until something comes along and starts digging. The German shepherd's amber eyes met hers, and Margaret couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this journey was unearthing more than just the mystery of a silver medal. Point Bellum appeared suddenly around a curve in the coastal highway, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled between maritime forest and the glittering expanse of the Gulf. The town had once thrived on shrimping and tourism, but as Margaret drove slowly down Main Street, she noted the shuttered storefronts and faded awnings that spoke of economic struggle. Not quite as I remember it, she murmured, navigating past a boarded-up souvenir shop. A few locals glanced curiously at her Buick. Outsiders were clearly uncommon here in the off-season. Donovan's garage occupied a corrugated metal building at the far end of town, its sun-bleached sign promising repairs, towing, and salvage. The gravel lot contained a handful of vehicles in various states of disrepair, watched over by an ancient bloodhound dozing on the concrete stoop. As Margaret parked, the bloodhound raised its head, exchanging a long look with Sargent through the car window. Some unspoken canine communication seemed to pass between them. Remarkable, Margaret said dryly. You've made a friend faster than I ever have. Inside the garage, country music competed with the metallic clang of tools. A broad-shouldered man in his 40s emerged from beneath a lifted pickup, wiping grease-stained hands on an even greasier rag. Help you? He asked, eyeing Margaret with surprise. Clearly not his usual clientele. Are you Lewis Donovan? Jack Tucker assisted me on the highway. He suggested you might repair my alternator properly. Recognition flashed across the mechanic's face. Old Jack, huh? Don't see him much these days. He gestured toward her Buick. Let's have a look. Outside, Margaret opened the passenger door for Sargent, who hopped down, metal still firmly in his jaws. Lewis let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. He knelt slowly, studying the dog. Never thought I'd see this old boy again. Margaret's pulse quickened. You know him? Sure do. Belonged to Henry Mason, lived out on Pelican Point. Lewis reached to pet Sargent, who allowed the touch with familiar ease. Called him Scout, if I recall correctly. Scout, Margaret repeated. The dog's ears perked at the name, though he showed no preference over his new designation. While Lewis examined the car, Margaret pressed for information. This Henry Mason, he was a fisherman, among other things. Mostly kept to himself. Lewis glanced up from the engine. House has been empty for months now. Henry had a stroke last winter, from what I heard. Do you know anything about this? Margaret gestured to the medal. Lewis straightened, wiping his hands. Silver Star's not something folks around here talk about much. Those who earn them usually don't discuss it. He studied the dog again. Mason served in Vietnam, that much I know. Took that dog everywhere. His expression softened. Must have been 10 miles Scout traveled to get to your town. Dog's got a sense about people, you know. So I'm learning, Margaret replied, oddly touched. Is there anyone else who might know more about Mr. Mason? Family, perhaps. Nephew comes around occasionally to check on the house. City boy, works for some big newspaper up north. Lewis closed the hood decisively. Need to order the part. Won't come until tomorrow morning at the earliest. Margaret's carefully ordered world tilted further. Tomorrow? But I need to get back. I have appointments, commitments. Got a motel just up the street. Lewis interrupted, unperturbed by her distress. Nothing fancy, but clean enough. Or you can sit in my waiting room until tomorrow, he added with a half-smile. Your choice. Recognizing defeat, Margaret nodded stiffly. The motel, then, and perhaps directions to Pelican Point. 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself standing before a faded blue cottage perched on a bluff overlooking the Gulf. Scout/Sergeant had led the way confidently, tugging at the makeshift leash Lewis had fashioned from a length of rope. The property showed signs of neglect. Overgrown sea oats, peeling paint, shutters hanging askew, yet retained a certain weathered dignity. This is it, then? Your home? Margaret asked the dog, who stared at the cottage with visible longing. A rusted mailbox confirmed. Mason, with a faded sticker beneath reading, no flyers, no solicitors, no exceptions. A man after my own heart, Margaret mused. The front door was secured with a sturdy padlock, but Scouts circled the building purposefully, leading Margaret to a rear deck. Here, weathered Adirondack chairs faced the endless blue horizon, and a hidden key box was affixed beneath the railing, its combination lock unopened but apparently familiar to the dog, who pawed at it insistently. I can't just break in, Margaret protested, though no one was there to witness or judge. Scout whined, dropping the medal for the first time since their journey began. He nudged it toward her with his nose. Margaret lifted the tarnished decoration, turning it over to examine the coordinates. They matched this location precisely. Whatever Scout had been tasked with delivering, they had reached its destination. But why me? She wondered aloud. Of all the people in Port Haven, why choose me? As she stood contemplating this mystery, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle reached her. Moments later, a rental car appeared in the driveway, and a man in his 30s emerged, briefcase in hand, surprise evident on his face at finding visitors at his uncle's abandoned home. Can I help you? He called, approaching cautiously. Before Margaret could answer, Scout bounded forward, medal once again secure in his mouth, tail wagging with unmistakable recognition. Scout! The man's voice cracked with emotion. He knelt as the German shepherd reached him, burying his face in the dog's fur. My God, where have you been, old friend? Margaret watched the reunion, feeling suddenly like an intruder. When the man finally looked up, tears glistened in eyes that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. I'm Daniel Mason, he said, extending his hand. And I think you and I have a lot to talk about. The interior of Henry Mason's cottage smelled of sea salt and abandonment. Dust motes danced in sunlight that filtered through unwashed windows, illuminating walls covered with framed photographs. Not family portraits as Margaret had expected, but stark black and white images of landscapes, townspeople, and historical moments. They spoke of a skilled eye and an intimate connection to the Gulf Coast's changing face over decades. My uncle was a documentary photographer before he retired, Daniel explained, following Margaret's gaze. Started as a combat photographer in Vietnam, then worked for National Geographic, AP, you name it. Not a fisherman? Margaret asked, recalling Lewis's description. Daniel smiled. That was his cover story. Said it kept people from asking too many questions about why he was always watching, always capturing. He gestured toward a glass-fronted cabinet filled with cameras of various vintages. The fishing was real enough, though. Man could find redfish in a mud puddle. Scout had settled on a faded rug near the stone fireplace, metal still clutched in his jaws, watching the humans with attentive eyes. How did you find him? Daniel asked, setting 2 mugs of hastily brewed coffee on the kitchen table. Margaret recounted the strange encounter in Port Haven, her reluctant caretaking, and the journey that had led her here. He was quite determined, she concluded, though I still don't understand why he sought me out specifically. Daniel studied her with an intensity that made Margaret uncomfortable. You really don't know, do you? Know what, Mr. Mason? Instead of answering, he crossed to a weathered roll-top desk and extracted a thick leather album. My uncle regained some speech after his stroke, but not enough to tell the whole story. He laid the album before her. Maybe this will help. Margaret opened it carefully, finding newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes meticulously organized by date. The earliest entries dated to 1968, Vietnam, and progressed through the decades, documenting environmental changes along the Gulf, industrial development, and community events. Your uncle was quite the archivist, she observed, turning pages with growing interest. He was documenting something specific, Daniel replied. Something he believed was important enough to risk his reputation for. As Margaret reached entries from the mid-1970s, she froze. A photograph showed a summer festival in what appeared to be Point Bellam's town square. Among the crowd, 2 young women stood laughing, arms linked. One was unmistakably a younger version of herself, and beside her, Caroline, Margaret whispered, her voice suddenly fragile. You recognize someone? Margaret's finger trembled as it traced her sister's smiling face. My sister. We haven't spoken in over 40 years. Daniel watched her reaction carefully. Turn the page. The next spread contained more photos from that summer. Caroline appearing repeatedly, often alongside a handsome young man with a distinctive scar above his right eyebrow. Candid shots at the beach, helping on a fishing boat, attending community meetings. Who was the man with her? Margaret asked, struggling to maintain her composure. Thomas Ellison. He was my uncle's best friend. Daniel's voice softened. And your sister's husband. The room seemed to tilt beneath Margaret. Caroline married? Here. For almost 30 years. They were happy, by all accounts. Margaret struggled to absorb this revelation. All these decades, her sister had been living just 30 miles away, building a life Margaret knew nothing about. The carefully constructed walls of her isolation cracked, allowing long-suppressed grief to seep through. Where is she now? She managed finally. Sunset Pines Care Center in Mobile. Daniel's expression turned sympathetic. Early-onset Alzheimer's. Tom passed 5 years ago, and when Caroline's condition worsened, she couldn't stay here alone. Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, focusing on the physical action to anchor herself against emotional turmoil. I see. Uncle Henry kept tabs on both of you all these years. He knew you were in Port Haven, knew you taught 3rd grade, lived alone. Daniel leaned forward. Scout didn't choose you randomly, Miss Caldwell. My uncle trained him to find you specifically. But why now? After all these years? Daniel sighed deeply. That's where things get complicated. He turned several pages in the album, revealing photographs of construction sites, handwritten notes about waste disposal, and newspaper clippings about abandoned development projects. My uncle documented decades of environmental corruption along this coast. Companies cutting corners, politicians taking bribes, ecosystems destroyed. He tapped a particular photograph showing 3 men in suits standing before a half-built structure on a pristine beach. Some of these people still hold power in this region. Margaret recognized one of the men, now a state senator known for his environmental advocacy. The hypocrisy was stark. 2 months ago, Uncle Henry told me he was ready to tell the whole truth about what happened in the 70s. Daniel's expression darkened. A week later, he had his stroke. The timing was suspicious. You believe someone harmed your uncle to silence him? I can't prove it. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. But as an investigative journalist, I've learned to recognize patterns. He nodded toward Scout. That medal was my uncle's most treasured possession. The fact that he sent it to you with Scout suggests he believed you were somehow key to this story. Margaret shook her head firmly. I know nothing about any of this. I left this area in 1975 and never looked back. Why did you leave? The question pierced Margaret's practiced armor. Family disagreement. Pride. Foolishness. She closed the album with finality. Ancient history now. Daniel studied her, disappointment evident. Scout traveled 10 miles with that medal, Miss Caldwell. My uncle believed you were important enough to send his most loyal companion to find you. I'm sorry about your uncle, Mr. Mason, truly. But I have a life in Port Haven. Ordered, predictable, safe. Whatever conspiracy theories you're investigating, I want no part of them. She stood abruptly. I should return to the motel. My car will be ready tomorrow. As she moved toward the door, Scout rose and blocked her path, amber eyes fixed on her with unmistakable challenge. The metal gleamed in the late afternoon light, a silent rebuke to her retreat. He won't let you leave, Daniel said quietly. Not until you understand why you're here. Margaret met the dog's steady gaze, feeling the carefully constructed walls of her life crumbling further with each passing moment. I'm too old for treasure hunts and conspiracy theories. Are you too old for reconciliation? Daniel asked softly. My uncle left something for both you and Caroline. Something he thought might heal old wounds. The word lodged in Margaret's chest like a physical pain. Healing was for those who acknowledged their brokenness, who were brave enough to face their past. Margaret had spent decades ensuring her wounds were too deeply buried to require attention. Yet Scout stood resolute, metal clutched firmly, a soldier who would not abandon his mission. One night, Margaret conceded finally. I'll stay one night. But tomorrow, I'm returning to Port Haven and my life. Daniel nodded, relief evident. That's all I ask. But as twilight descended over Point Bellum, Margaret stood on the cottage's weathered deck, watching waves crash against the shore, and wondered if her carefully ordered existence would ever truly be hers again. Dawn broke over the gulf in streaks of amber and rose, the colors reflecting on the water's surface like shattered stained glass. Margaret had spent a restless night on Henry Mason's worn sofa, Scout maintaining vigilant watch from a nearby armchair. She'd refused Daniel's offer of the master bedroom, unwilling to further entrench herself in this unexpected detour. She stood now on the deck, coffee warming her hands, watching the tide recede to reveal a wide expanse of pristine sand. In the distance, a lone figure walked along the water's edge, accompanied by a leaping dog, Daniel and Scout, embarking on what appeared to be a morning ritual. Margaret had risen early, her body clock resistant to change despite the disruptions to her routine. By 6:30, she'd already called Lewis at the garage, waking him, judging by his groggy response, to confirm her car would be ready by noon. She'd also left a message with Nancy from the library committee explaining her continued absence, crafting a vague explanation about family matters that wasn't entirely untrue. You're up early, Daniel observed, climbing the deck steps with Scout bounding ahead. The dog still carried the metal, seemingly untroubled by its weight after all this time. Old habits, Margaret replied, shifting to maintain her personal space as Daniel joined her at the railing. Uncle Henry was the same way. Said dawn patrol in Vietnam taught him to rise with the sun. He glanced at her sideways. Did you sleep at all? Enough. In truth, she'd spent most of the night oscillating between examining Henry's photographs and staring at the ceiling, memories she'd long suppressed pushing insistently against her consciousness. Daniel accepted her deflection with a nod. We should head to the beach after breakfast. The coordinates on the metal, they point to a specific spot about a quarter-mile south. Mr. Mason, Daniel, please. Daniel, Margaret conceded reluctantly. I appreciate your hospitality, but my car will be ready at noon. I really must return to Port Haven. Just an hour, he pressed. Scout didn't bring you all this way for nothing. As if understanding, the German shepherd placed the metal carefully at Margaret's feet, then looked up at her with what she could only interpret as expectation. This is absurd, she muttered, but found herself nodding agreement. They set out after a quick breakfast, following the shoreline south. Scout led the way, occasionally circling back as if to ensure they were keeping pace. The morning was glorious, cool breeze off the water, sandpipers skittering along the surf's edge, pelicans diving dramatically for fish offshore. When was the last time you walked on a beach? Daniel asked, navigating around a cluster of washed-up driftwood. I don't recall, Margaret answered automatically, though the truth was she remembered precisely. August 17th, 1975, the day she'd left Caroline standing in tears on this very shore. Uncle Henry came here every day, right up until his stroke, Daniel continued, undeterred by her brevity. Said the rhythm of the waves kept his mind clear, helped him see patterns others missed. Margaret found herself wondering what patterns Henry Mason had observed in her life from afar, what conclusions he'd drawn about the rigid, solitary existence she'd constructed in Port Haven. Scout suddenly raced ahead, then began moving in tight circles at a spot where the dunes met the flat, wet sand. His excitement was unmistakable. "I think we're here," Daniel called, quickening his pace. Margaret checked her watch. They'd been walking exactly 17 minutes. "The coordinates match this location?" "To the decimal," Daniel confirmed, joining Scout. He extracted a small GPS device from his pocket, verified their position, then knelt in the sand. "Whatever Uncle Henry buried, it's here." Scout dropped the metal beside Daniel's knee and began digging frantically, sand flying between his paws. Margaret watched with reluctant fascination as Daniel joined the effort, scooping away the loosened sand. "There's definitely something here," he grunted after several minutes of excavation. "Feel like helping?" Against her better judgment, Margaret knelt in the sand, disregarding what it would do to her linen slacks. Together, they continued digging until Daniel's fingers scraped against something solid. "Got it." He carefully extracted a military-grade waterproof case, roughly the size of a shoe box, sealed with heavy-duty clasps. Its surface was scratched but intact, designed to withstand both water and time. "Open it," Margaret urged, surprising herself with her eagerness. Daniel brushed away sand and examined the case. "It has a combination lock." He tried several sequences without success, then looked to Margaret. "Any ideas? Birthdays, anniversaries?" She shook her head. "I didn't know your uncle." Scout whined, nudging the metal with his nose. Daniel picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Of course," he murmured. He input the last 4 digits engraved on the back of the metal, not coordinates, Margaret realized, but a date. 1968. The lock clicked open. Inside, protected by waterproof sealing, lay a leather-bound journal, a stack of black and white photographs, and a sealed envelope with Margaret and Caroline written across the front in careful block lettering. Daniel lifted the journal reverently. "This is my uncle's war diary. He never showed it to anyone, not even my father." But Margaret's attention fixed on the envelope bearing her name alongside her sister's. With trembling fingers, she reached for it. "May I?" Daniel nodded, busying himself with examining the photographs. Giving her privacy, she realized. Margaret broke the seal carefully and extracted several handwritten pages. The script was shaky but legible, dated just 3 months earlier. "Margaret and Caroline, if you're reading this, then Scout completed his mission, and my nephew likely helped connect the dots. Good boy, Scout. Best partner a man could ask for. I don't have much time. There are people watching, and what I'm about to reveal has been covered up for nearly 50 years. But some truths refuse to stay buried, just as some bonds can never truly be severed, no matter how hard we try to cut them. In 1975, I documented illegal waste dumping in the protected marshlands near Point Bellum. Chemical waste from factories upriver, buried in the sand, seeping into the water. I had proof, photographs, samples, testimony from workers. The kind of proof that would have ended careers, closed businesses, and sent powerful men to prison. Those same men discovered my investigation. They couldn't touch me directly. My military background and press connections provided some protection. So instead, they targeted those close to me. Thomas Ellison, my best friend and Caroline's new husband, lost his fishing licenses. Threatening notes appeared. Windows were broken. Then they found the perfect leverage. You, Margaret, the respected schoolteacher with a promising career in Port Haven. They made it clear, if Caroline maintained contact with you, your career would be destroyed by manufactured scandals. If you remained close to Caroline, Tom would face worse than broken windows. The sisters who had been inseparable were strategically driven apart. Caroline never told you the real reason for her sudden coldness. She carried that burden alone for decades, believing she was protecting you. I've spent my life documenting the truth, but I failed to reveal this one when it mattered most. My silence allowed a family to be broken and environmental crimes to continue. That must end now. The photographs in this box prove everything. Daniel knows what to do with them. But more important than justice for the past is reconciliation in the present. Caroline's mind is fading, but she still remembers you, Margaret. Still asks about her big sister on her lucid days. It may be too late for many things, but it's not too late for this. Find each other again before all chance is lost. With respect and hope, Henry Mason. Margaret lowered the letter, her vision blurred with tears she hadn't permitted herself in decades. The carefully constructed narrative of her life, that she'd chosen isolation, that her estrangement from Caroline had been necessary and mutual, crumbled like a sand castle before the tide. "Miss Caldwell." Daniel's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right?" She looked up, finding concern in his expression. Scout had settled beside her, his warm presence unexpectedly comforting. "No," Margaret answered honestly. "I don't believe I am." And for the first time in 40 years, Margaret Caldwell allowed herself to admit how profoundly broken she had been all along. The Buick hummed steadily as Margaret guided it north along the coastal highway, Scout occupying the passenger seat he'd previously been denied. The metal rested on the dashboard, catching occasional glints of sunlight. The back seat held the waterproof case and its revelatory contents, secured by the seatbelt as if transporting a precious passenger. Daniel followed in his rental car, having insisted on accompanying Margaret back to Port Haven. Journalistic curiosity, he'd claimed, though Margaret suspected Henry Mason's nephew simply wanted to ensure she didn't retreat behind her walls of isolation once again. 6 hours earlier, she'd been desperate to return to her orderly life. Now, approaching the familiar streets of her adopted hometown, Margaret felt as though she were driving toward a stranger's existence. The dashboard clock read 2:17 p.m., school dismissal time. As they passed Port Haven Elementary, children streamed from the building in colorful clusters, their exuberant energy a stark contrast to Margaret's exhaustion. She'd taught in that building for 4 decades, mentoring generations of the town's children while keeping everyone, colleagues included, at a carefully calibrated distance. "I wonder how many lives I've touched without truly connecting," she murmured to Scout, who tilted his head attentively. "All those years, all those children, and I never let anyone see beyond Ms. Caldwell, the precise, dependable teacher." Port Haven's town square appeared ahead, unchanged from when she'd left it barely 24 hours ago, though it felt like weeks had passed. Margaret pulled into her usual parking spot outside Green's Market, Daniel finding space several cars down. "Home sweet home," she told Scout with unexpected bitterness. The dog responded by retrieving the metal from the dashboard, assuming his now familiar position of alertness. As they exited the car, Margaret became acutely aware of the stares directed their way. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, her unexplained absence and return with both a dog and a stranger were guaranteed to fuel speculation. Margaret Caldwell. Elaine Green hurried from her store, wiping hands on her apron. "We were worried sick. Nancy said you left town on family business," which made no sense since everyone knows you don't have. She stopped abruptly, apparently realizing the insensitivity of her observation. "Hello, Elaine," Margaret replied stiffly. "As you can see, I've returned safely." Elaine's gaze darted between Scout and Daniel, curiosity practically radiating from her. "And with company. Daniel Mason." He introduced himself, extending a hand. "I'm helping Miss Caldwell with a research project." "Research?" Elaine echoed, clearly filing the information away for later dissemination. She bent slightly toward Scout. "And who's this handsome fellow? Staying with you, Margaret?" Before Margaret could answer, Sheriff Davis approached, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. "So the wandering dog found a home after all," he observed, eyeing Scout with reluctant respect. "Wondered where you disappeared to, Miss Caldwell." "A brief trip to the coast," Margaret replied, discomfort growing as a small crowd began to gather. This level of attention was precisely what she'd spent decades avoiding. "Margaret," Nancy Williams from the library committee hurried over, her sensible shoes clacking on the pavement. "You missed the fundraiser planning meeting. We had to postpone the entire agenda." The accusation in Nancy's tone, that Margaret had disrupted the committee's carefully ordered schedule, would have mortified her just days ago. Now, with Henry Mason's letter burning a hole in her pocket and the weight of 40 lost years pressing on her conscience, the trivial concerns of the library committee seemed absurd. "I apologize for the inconvenience," Margaret said, her tone lacking its usual deference. "Something more important required my attention." Nancy's eyebrows shot upward at this unprecedented departure from Margaret's reliable compliance. Before she could respond, Dr. Tom Wilson pushed through the growing crowd. "I see Sergeant found what he was looking for," he said, genuine warmth in his voice as he crouched to greet Scout. though I hear his name is actually Scout. You knew? Margaret asked, surprised. Had my suspicions, Tom admitted, straightening. That medal, silver stars aren't common around here. Only knew of one recipient in the area. He nodded respectfully to Daniel. Your uncle was a good man. Sorry to hear about his stroke. Daniel's expression registered surprise. You knew my uncle? Paths crossed during some environmental research I was doing. Henry Mason documented things others preferred to ignore. Tom's gaze shifted meaningfully to Margaret, like connections that need restoring. The crowd had grown larger, voices overlapping as townspeople speculated openly about Margaret's unexpected behavior. The press of bodies, the cacophony of questions, it was overwhelming. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private, Tom suggested, noting Margaret's increasing discomfort. My house, she agreed gratefully. As they attempted to navigate away from the curious onlookers, a sleek black SUV pulled up at the edge of the square. Two men in business attire emerged, scanning the crowd with practiced efficiency. Daniel tensed beside her. Crawford Development Executives, he whispered. The company implicated in those photos. How did they know we'd be here? Tom stepped protectively closer. Word travels fast in small towns. One of the men approached, his smile professional but eyes cold. Miss Caldwell? Roger Kincaid, Crawford Development. Might we have a word? We understand you've come into possession of some historical materials that might interest our company. Margaret felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. The photographs in Henry's waterproof case implicated Crawford in decades of environmental crimes. Crimes now being linked to her sister's husband's harassment and her own professional isolation. I'm afraid I have no idea what you're talking about, she replied, meeting his gaze squarely. I think you do, Kincaid countered smoothly. Point Bellum. Henry Mason's creative documentation. We'd like to offer fair compensation for those materials. They're not for sale, Daniel interjected, stepping forward. Kincaid's smile hardened. Everything has a price, Mr. Mason. Even a retired schoolteacher's reputation. His gaze returned to Margaret. Small towns depend on trust, don't they? Careers are built on respectability. The threat was unmistakable. The same tactics used to separate her from Caroline 40 years earlier, now deployed again. But Margaret was no longer the young woman who could be intimidated by insinuations against her character. Mr. Kincaid, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed square. In my 40 years of teaching, I learned that bullies rely on isolation and fear. They target those they believe will remain silent. She stepped forward, aware that every eye in Port Haven's town square was fixed on this confrontation. I've been silent too long. That ends today. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Margaret turned to address her neighbors directly. For decades, I've lived among you as a respected but distant fixture, reliable, predictable, safe. The truth is, I cultivated that distance deliberately after being manipulated into abandoning my only sister. Gasps and whispers followed this revelation. Margaret had never spoken publicly about her family. The photographs and documents we discovered prove that Crawford Development and their political allies deliberately separated me from my sister to conceal environmental crimes they committed along our coast. Crimes that continue to affect the health of our communities today. Kincaid's professional demeanor slipped. These are serious, unfounded accusations. They're documented, Daniel interrupted, by an award-winning photojournalist who preserved the evidence for decades. Sheriff Davis moved closer, his interest now professional. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Illegal dumping of industrial chemicals in protected marshlands, Tom Wilson answered. I've suspected it for years from the unusual cancer clusters and wildlife abnormalities I've documented. But Henry Mason had proof. Margaret watched the realization spread through the crowd, that their quiet town had been touched by corruption reaching back decades, that the reserved schoolteacher they thought they knew had a history and voice they'd never heard. Miss Caldwell, Kincaid said, his tone now openly threatening. Consider carefully before making public accusations that could result in significant legal consequences. Scout growled softly, pressing against Margaret's leg. She placed a hand on his head, drawing strength from his steadfast presence. Mr. Kincaid, she replied, decades of classroom authority ringing in her voice. I've spent 40 years hiding from connection because of men like you. I won't spend one more day in that prison. She turned to Daniel. I believe we have a drive to Mobile tomorrow. My sister has waited long enough. As Kincaid and his colleague retreated to their vehicle, visibly discomfited by the public confrontation, the townspeople of Port Haven witnessed something none had seen before. Margaret Caldwell, walking tall through their midst, a loyal dog at her side, heading home not to isolation but to prepare for reconciliation. And for the first time in decades, she felt not the burden of maintaining walls, but the exhilarating freedom of watching them crumble. The Sunset Pines Care Center in Mobile stood 3 stories tall, its red brick exterior softened by cascading crepe myrtles in full bloom. Margaret sat in the Buick's passenger seat, having yielded driving duties to Daniel for the first time, and studied the building's broad windows and well-maintained grounds. Behind those walls, her sister waited, unaware that today would end 4 decades of separation. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked gently, turning off the engine. Margaret smoothed invisible wrinkles from her dress, a soft blue linen she'd unearthed from the back of her closet, chosen specifically because it matched one Caroline had admired in that long-ago summer of 1975. "No," she admitted, "but that hasn't stopped me lately." In the back seat, Scout whined softly. The medal remained in his possession, though he developed a habit of placing it in Margaret's palm whenever she seemed particularly anxious, as if offering a talisman of courage. The 24 hours since their confrontation with Kincaid in Port Haven's town square had passed in a whirlwind. The evidence from Henry Mason's waterproof box had been formally documented by Sheriff Davis and secured in the county's evidence vault. Daniel had contacted colleagues at his newspaper, setting in motion an investigation that promised to extend beyond local interest. And Margaret, in a final dismantling of her carefully constructed isolation, had allowed Tom Wilson and several neighbors to assist in preparing her home for Scout's permanent residency, and for the possibility of Caroline's visits, should her health permit. "She has good days and difficult ones," the care center's director explained as she led Margaret and Daniel down a sunlit corridor. Scout had been granted special permission to accompany them, his status as an emotional support animal hastily arranged through Tom's veterinary credentials. "This morning has been promising. She's been in the garden since breakfast." The director paused outside a glass door leading to an enclosed courtyard. "I should prepare you. The disease affects everyone differently. Caroline recognizes some people instantly on certain days, while familiar faces may seem like strangers on others." Margaret nodded, her throat too tight for words. Through the glass, she could see a silver-haired woman in a wheelchair, head bent over a sketchpad, a nurse standing attentively nearby. Though decades had passed, Margaret would have known her sister anywhere. The same delicate profile, the same way she tilted her head when concentrating. "Would you like me to introduce you first?" the director offered. "No," Margaret found her voice. I think Scout should go first." Understanding flickered in the director's eyes. She nodded to an attendant, who opened the door just wide enough for the German Shepherd to slip through. Scout entered the garden cautiously, metal secure in his jaws, scanning the space until his amber gaze locked on Caroline. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm as he approached her wheelchair. Through the glass, Margaret watched her sister look up from her drawing. Confusion crossed Caroline's features, followed by dawning recognition, and then, like sunshine breaking through clouds, pure joy. "Scout!" Caroline's voice carried clearly through the glass. "Oh my goodness, Scout." The German Shepherd placed his head gently in her lap, allowing Caroline to stroke his fur with trembling hands. She noticed the medal, carefully taking it from him and turning it over in her palm, a gesture so reminiscent of their shared childhood that Margaret had to steady herself against the doorframe. "Where have you been, old friend?" Caroline asked the dog. "And what treasure have you brought me this time?" It was the opening Margaret had not dared hope for. She nodded to the attendant, who opened the door fully. With Daniel's reassuring presence behind her, Margaret stepped into the sunlight. For a moment, she simply stood, allowing her sister to notice her. Caroline looked up, her gaze traveling from Scout to the newcomer. Confusion clouded her features again. "Hello, Caroline," Margaret said softly. Caroline tilted her head, studying Margaret with the focused attention that had always characterized her artistic nature. "Do I know you?" The question cut deeper than Margaret had anticipated, though the director had prepared her for this possibility. "Yes," she answered, moving closer. "From a long time ago." Caroline frowned slightly, then returned her attention to the medal in her palm. Scout brought this. It's Henry's. From Vietnam. She looked up again, more sharply. Are you from Vietnam? No, Carrie, Margaret said, using the childhood nickname no one else had ever used. I'm Maggie, your sister. Something flickered in Caroline's eyes, recognition struggling against confusion. Maggie died, she said matter-of-factly. She never came back. Margaret knelt beside the wheelchair, her knees protesting but her heart driving her forward. I didn't die, Carrie. I stayed away. I thought it was what you wanted. I was wrong. We were both wrong. Scout pressed against Caroline's side, his presence seeming to anchor her as she studied Margaret's face. Maggie had a freckle, right here, she said, touching her own temple. With trembling fingers, Margaret brushed aside her silver hair, revealing the small brown mark she usually kept hidden. It's still there. Caroline reached out hesitantly, her fingertips cool against Margaret's skin. Maggie, she whispered, wonder breaking through confusion. My Maggie. Then, with a clarity that belied her diagnosis, Caroline grasped Margaret's hands. You got my messages. The ones I sent with Henry's dog. Margaret blinked back tears. Scout found me. He brought me back to you. I knew he would, Caroline said with satisfaction. I told him every day, find Maggie, bring her home. Dogs remember, even when people forget. Margaret glanced at Daniel, who stood respectfully at a distance, and Scout, who watched the reunion with evident contentment. The circle was complete. Henry Mason's loyal companion had fulfilled his final mission. The sisters talked through the afternoon, their conversation flowing unevenly between past and present. Sometimes Caroline was lucid, filling in missing pieces of the 40-year separation. Other times she drifted, confusing Margaret with their mother or believing they were young girls again. Throughout it all, Scout remained steadfast beside Caroline's wheelchair, the medal now back in his possession, a guardian of connections that transcended time and misunderstanding. As sunset painted the garden in amber light, Caroline grew tired. The nurse indicated it was time to return to her room. Margaret helped settle her sister into bed, promising to return the next day. You won't disappear again? Caroline asked, momentarily clear and vulnerable. Never, Margaret assured her, squeezing her hand. I'm staying close from now on. As they prepared to leave, Caroline called out one last time. Maggie, the box. Did you find it? Margaret turned back. Yes, we found Henry's box. The photographs are safe. Caroline shook her head impatiently. Not that box. The other one. Her gaze drifted to Scout. He knows. The medal shows 2 places, not 1. In the hallway, Margaret relayed Caroline's cryptic statement to Daniel. 2 places? I thought the coordinates led only to the beach. Daniel examined the medal closely under the hallway lights. Wait, there's something we missed. See how these numbers are slightly offset from the others? He pointed to an almost imperceptible variation in the engraving. These could be secondary coordinates. They returned to Port Haven that evening with renewed purpose. The following morning, Scout led them to a different location. Not the open beach, but a sheltered cove accessible only at low tide. There, beneath a limestone outcropping, they discovered a second waterproof container. Unlike the first, this one contained no evidence of environmental crimes or political corruption, but something far more precious: documentation of lives interrupted but not erased. Caroline's sketches of Margaret from memory, letters written but never sent, photographs of Caroline's wedding, of her home with Thomas, of holidays and ordinary days, all carefully preserved by Henry Mason for a reunion he had always believed would come. 6 months after Scout had first appeared in Port Haven's town square, Margaret stood in her transformed backyard, watching as neighbors and newfound friends gathered for a dedication ceremony. The once meticulously landscaped space had been reimagined as a native plant garden, complete with a stone path and small pond. At its center stood a bronze sculpture of a German shepherd, head held high, a medal clutched in its jaws. The actual silver star remained with Scout, who now divided his time between Margaret's home and Caroline's care center, having been officially certified as a therapy dog through Tom Wilson's advocacy. His mission had evolved from delivering a message to serving as a living bridge between the sisters, his steady presence helping Caroline navigate the increasingly foggy landscape of her memory. The Crawford development scandal had grown into state and federal investigations, with Daniel's newspaper coverage bringing national attention to the decades-long environmental abuse along the Gulf Coast. Margaret found herself reluctantly at the center of the story, her testimony about the forced separation from Caroline providing the human element that transformed statistics into compelling narrative. "They never expected you to find your voice," Daniel told her as they watched the gathering from the porch. "That was their mistake." Margaret's gaze moved over the scene. Tom Wilson deep in conversation with Sheriff Davis. Elaine Green arranging refreshments with military precision. Nancy from the library committee leading Caroline in her wheelchair to see the garden's newest addition. Scout trotted between groups, accepting pats and treats, the medal catching the sunlight as he moved. Their mistake, Margaret agreed, was believing isolation equals safety. She smiled as Caroline laughed at something Nancy said, a clear moment in an increasingly clouded mind. Real safety comes from connection, from community, from truth. "A lesson worth learning at any age," Daniel observed. Margaret nodded, thinking of the classroom she'd visited earlier that week. Third graders eager to hear from their legendary former teacher about the importance of environmental stewardship and standing up for what's right. For the first time in her career, she'd shared her personal story alongside her professional knowledge, watching understanding bloom in young eyes. As the dedication ceremony began, Margaret took her place beside Caroline, their hands linked as they had been in childhood. Scout sat at attention between them. His mission transformed but not completed. Never completed, for loyalty and love require constant renewal, constant vigilance against the forces that would separate what belongs together. In her pocket, Margaret carried Henry Mason's letter, its creases soft from frequent reading, its message a reminder that it is never too late to begin again, never too late to find what was lost, never too late to become what we might have been all along. "Thank you," she whispered to Scout as the ribbon was cut, officially opening the garden to the community, "for bringing me home." The German shepherd leaned against her leg, metal secure in his jaws, amber eyes reflecting the wisdom of a creature who understood what humans so often forget, that the most important journeys are not measured in miles, but in the courage to cross the distances we create within ourselves. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched all the way through," and share your thoughts on this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's super exciting.